The apartment felt smaller somehow, charged with an electricity that made every breath feel deliberate and weighted with significance. Dennis Williams sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped so tightly between his knees that his knuckles had gone white, the tendons standing out like cords beneath his skin. Across from him, Kenneth Hughes paced the length of the living room with restless energy, running his hands through his dark hair in that familiar way he did when the world had tilted off its axis and left him scrambling for balance. The late afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, casting golden stripes across the hardwood floor that Kenneth's feet crossed and recrossed in an endless pattern. The air conditioning hummed its steady rhythm, but even that familiar white noise couldn't mask the tension that had settled between them like a living thing. "I can't keep pretending this is just friendship," Dennis whispered, his voice barely audible above the mechanical hum. The words felt like they were being torn from somewhere deep in his chest, raw and honest in a way that made him feel exposed. "I've been lying to myself for months, Ken. Every time you come over after work, every time you stay late on the good days when you don't need an excuse, every time you look at me like you're trying to solve some puzzle you can't quite figure out." He paused, watching Kenneth's shoulders tense further, the muscles beneath his blue button-down shirt going rigid. "Every time you complain about feeling empty with Sarah, every time you ask me these hypothetical questions about connection and what real intimacy feels like, I want to tell you that maybe you're looking in the wrong places. Maybe what you're searching for isn't as far away as you think." Kenneth stopped pacing abruptly, his back still to Dennis. The sudden stillness was almost worse than the restless movement had been. Dennis could see the way Kenneth's breathing had changed, quick and shallow, the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken feelings and careful boundaries that were suddenly crumbling. When Kenneth finally turned around, his brown eyes held something Dennis had never seen before, something raw and unguarded that made his heart hammer against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. There was fear there, yes, but also something that looked like relief, like a man finally allowing himself to acknowledge a truth he'd been running from. "What are you saying?" Kenneth's voice cracked on the question, betraying the careful control he usually maintained. Dennis stood up slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him, feeling like he was standing at the edge of a precipice with no way back. "I'm saying I'm in love with you. I have been for longer than I want to admit, longer than I've been willing to acknowledge even to myself. I'm saying that every time you complain about feeling empty in your relationships, every time you tell me something's missing, every time you ask me these hypothetical questions about what real connection feels like, I want to tell you that maybe you're looking in the wrong places." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Kenneth's eyes dropped to Dennis's lips for just a moment, so brief it might have been imaginary, but Dennis caught it. He caught the way Kenneth's breathing had changed, the way his hands had started to shake, the way he was looking at Dennis like he was seeing him for the first time. "Dennis," Kenneth whispered, and the name sounded different coming from his lips now, weighted with something that made the air between them shimmer with possibility and promise. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how two straight friends found themselves standing in a living room, confessing feelings that neither had fully understood until now, we need to go back to where it all began. We need to understand the slow burn of realization, the gradual shift from friendship to something deeper, the careful dance that they'd been performing round each other for months without even realizing it. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you were watching from and hype this video, Mayo, in the comments. 3 months earlier, Dennis had been living what most people would consider a perfectly normal, if somewhat predictable, life. He had a decent job at a mid-sized marketing firm downtown, where he spent his days crafting campaigns for clients who sold everything from organic dog food to luxury watches. His corner cubicle had a view of the parking lot and a motivational poster about teamwork that someone in HR had hung there years ago. He had a comfortable one-bedroom apartment in the suburbs, decorated in what his mother generously called bachelor chic, and what his sister more accurately described as furniture store showroom meets college dorm. Most importantly, he had what his mother liked to call prospects in the dating department. He'd been seeing Jessica Harris on and off for about 6 months, a relationship that felt pleasant enough, but lacked the spark that everyone talked about in movies and romance novels. Jessica was objectively perfect for him, at least on paper. She was attractive, intelligent, successful in her own right as a nurse at the local hospital, and she seemed to genuinely enjoy his company. Their dates were nice, their conversations were engaging, and their physical relationship was satisfying, if not particularly passionate. Yet something was missing, some indefinable element that Dennis couldn't quite put his finger on. He found himself going through the motions of romance without feeling truly invested, saying the right words and making the right gestures, while feeling like he was performing a role rather than living his life. Kenneth had been his friend since college, one of those easy friendships that had survived graduation, job changes, and various romantic entanglements, without much effort or maintenance. They'd met during their sophomore year at State, thrown together as lab partners in a chemistry class that neither of them had wanted to take. What started as a practical partnership born of academic necessity had evolved into something deeper, a genuine friendship built on shared humor, similar values, and a comfortable compatibility that made spending time together feel effortless. After graduation, they'd both ended up in the same city more by coincidence than design. Kenneth worked in finance, something involving numbers and spreadsheets that Dennis had never fully understood despite Kenneth's patient attempts to explain it. They grabbed beers after work sometimes, watched games on weekends, and maintained the kind of casual male friendship that required little emotional maintenance beyond showing up and being present for each other. That had been before Kenneth started coming over after work, before everything changed in ways neither of them had seen coming. It began innocently enough, the way most life-altering changes do. Kenneth had been having problems with his girlfriend Sarah Collins, problems that seemed to multiply with each passing week, like some kind of relationship cancer. She was a lovely woman, a kindergarten teacher with blonde hair and a laugh that could light up a room, but she wanted things from Kenneth that he seemed incapable of providing. She wanted more commitment, more emotional availability, more of something intangible that Kenneth couldn't seem to access or understand. He'd started showing up at Dennis's apartment around 6:30 in the evening, usually with takeout from whatever restaurant had caught his eye on the drive over and a litany of complaints about how disconnected he felt in his relationship. At first, Dennis had assumed it was just a phase, the kind of rough patch that most couples went through before either working things out or calling it quits. "It's like I'm playing a role," Kenneth had said one Tuesday evening in late July, picking at his Chinese food while sprawled across Dennis's couch like he owned the place. The summer heat had been oppressive that day, and even with the air conditioning running full blast, there was a heaviness to the air that seemed to match Kenneth's mood. "Like I know all the lines I'm supposed to say, all the gestures I'm supposed to make, but none of it feels real. Does that make sense?" Dennis had nodded from his position on the opposite end of the couch, though he wasn't entirely sure it did. His own relationship with Jessica felt comfortable, familiar, like a well-worn sweater that fit adequately without being particularly exciting. But Kenneth's description of feeling like an actor in his own life struck something deeper, something that made Dennis's chest tighten with a recognition he couldn't quite name. "Maybe you're just not compatible," Dennis had offered, the kind of practical advice that friends were supposed to give in these situations. "Maybe you need someone who gets you better, someone who doesn't make you feel like you have to perform." Kenneth had looked at him then with an expression that Dennis would later recognize as significant, though at the time it had simply felt like gratitude mixed with something else, something Dennis couldn't quite identify. "Yeah," Kenneth had said softly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed disproportionate to the simple word. "Maybe I do." The visits became more frequent as the summer wore on, evolving from occasional drop-ins to an almost daily routine. Kenneth would text around 5:30 asking if Dennis was free, and Dennis always was. He found himself looking forward to these evenings in a way that surprised him, planning his schedule around the possibility that Kenneth might need somewhere to go, someone to talk to. He started keeping Kenneth's favorite beer in the refrigerator, learned which Thai restaurant delivered fastest, and found himself genuinely disappointed on the rare evenings when Kenneth didn't show up. They'd order dinner from a rotating selection of local restaurants, watch whatever was on television, and talk about everything except the growing tension that seemed to accumulate in the space between them like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. Dennis began to notice things he'd previously overlooked, Small details that seemed suddenly significant. The way Kenneth's eyes would linger on him sometimes when he thought Dennis wasn't looking. The way Kenneth had started sitting closer to him on the couch, close enough that their knees would brush when one of them shifted position. The way Kenneth seemed to find excuses to touch Dennis's shoulder or arm during conversations. Casual contact that felt anything but casual. The apartment itself began to change, adapting to accommodate Kenneth's frequent presence. A second coffee mug appeared in the dish drainer and stayed there. Kenneth's phone charger found a permanent home on the kitchen counter. A spare toothbrush materialized in the bathroom medicine cabinet, ostensibly for emergencies, but used with increasing frequency as Kenneth started staying later and later into the evening. It was during one of these extended evenings in early August that Kenneth asked the question that changed everything. The question that would later serve as a dividing line between before and after. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to kiss another guy? They'd been watching some mindless action movie, something with explosions and one-liners that neither of them was really paying attention to. Empty beer bottles were scattered across the coffee table like evidence of their evening together, and the comfortable silence that had become their default had settled over them like a familiar blanket. Kenneth's question came out of nowhere, delivered in the same casual tone he might use to ask about the weather or comment on the movie. Dennis felt his heart skip, then start beating double time, the rhythm so loud he was sure Kenneth could hear it. What do you mean? The question was a stalling tactic, a way to buy time while his brain tried to process what Kenneth had just asked and why he'd asked it. Dennis's mouth had gone dry, and he found himself hyper-aware of Kenneth's presence beside him on the couch, the way their bodies were angled toward each other, the way Kenneth's leg was pressed against his own. I don't know, Kenneth said, still not looking away from the television screen where someone was defusing a bomb with 30 seconds left on the timer. Just hypothetically, like, do you think it would feel different? Do you think you'd know if you were into it? Dennis's brain felt like it was short-circuiting. I guess I've never really thought about it. It was a lie, and they both knew it. He'd been thinking about it more and more lately, specifically thinking about what it might be like to kiss Kenneth. The thought had been creeping up on him in quiet moments, catching him off guard when Kenneth laughed at something funny or when their hands accidentally brushed reaching for the same thing. It was a thought that Dennis had been pushing down, explaining away, categorizing as some kind of weird psychological response to spending so much time together. Sarah asked me yesterday if I'd ever been attracted to a man, Kenneth continued, his voice carefully neutral in a way that suggested the opposite. She said sometimes she feels like I'm holding something back, like there's some part of me that's not fully present with her, like I'm saving the real me for someone else. Dennis felt a knife twist in his chest, sharp and unexpected. What did you tell her? I told her no, of course, but then I couldn't stop thinking about it, about why she would ask that, about whether she sees something I don't see, something I'm not willing to acknowledge. Kenneth finally turned to look at Dennis, and there was something vulnerable in his expression that made Dennis's breath catch. Do you think it's possible to not know something that fundamental about yourself? To live your whole life thinking you understand who you are, only to discover you've been missing something crucial? The conversation had ended there, shifting back to safer territory as they both seemed to realize they were venturing into dangerous waters. But something fundamental had changed in that moment. Some invisible line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Dennis found himself watching Kenneth differently, noticing things he'd previously overlooked or explained away as simple friendship. The way Kenneth's eyes lingered on him sometimes when he thought Dennis wasn't looking, a gaze that felt different from casual friendship, more intense and searching. The way he seemed to find excuses to touch Dennis's shoulder or arm during conversations, contact that lasted just a beat longer than necessary. The way he'd started staying later and later until some evenings he'd fall asleep on the couch and wake up there in the morning, disoriented and apologetic but somehow reluctant to leave. Dennis started having dreams that left him confused and aching when he woke up. Dreams where Kenneth's hypothetical question became reality, where the careful distance they maintained dissolved into something electric and inevitable. He'd lie in bed afterward, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince himself that this was just a phase, just some weird psychological response to spending so much time together. But the dreams kept coming, vivid and detailed, and impossible to dismiss as mere fantasy. In these dreams, Kenneth would look at him with that same vulnerable expression he'd worn during their conversation about attraction. But instead of pulling back, instead of retreating to safer ground, Kenneth would move closer. In these dreams, Dennis could feel the warmth of Kenneth's skin, could taste the sweetness of his mouth, could lose himself in the feeling of being wanted by someone he'd never allowed himself to want in return. But the dreams kept coming, and Kenneth kept coming over, and the space between them kept shrinking in ways that felt both terrifying and necessary, like gravity pulling them towards some inevitable collision. The breaking point came on a Friday evening in late October, when the leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, and the air had taken on that crisp quality that promised winter was coming. Kenneth had shown up earlier than usual, around 5 o'clock, looking haggard and defeated in a way that made Dennis's chest tighten with concern and something that might have been protective instinct. "Sarah and I broke up," Kenneth announced without preamble, dropping onto the couch like his strings had been cut, like he'd been holding himself upright through sheer force of will and had finally run out of strength. Dennis felt a complex mix of emotions surge through him, relief and concern and something that might have been hope, all tangled together in a knot he couldn't untangle. "What happened?" "She said she couldn't compete with someone who didn't exist," Kenneth said, his voice hollow and exhausted. He was staring at his hands, which were clasped in his lap, and Dennis could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was holding himself like he might fall apart if he relaxed even slightly. "She said I was in love with some fantasy person and she was tired of trying to measure up to someone she'd never meet." Dennis sat down beside him, careful to maintain their usual distance, even though every instinct was telling him to move closer, to offer comfort in a way that went beyond words. "That doesn't make sense, doesn't it?" Kenneth turned to look at him, and Dennis saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression that made his breath catch. "What if she's right? What if I have been comparing every relationship to some impossible standard? What if I've been looking for something that doesn't exist? Ken, what if the person I've been looking for has been right here the whole time?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Kenneth was looking at Dennis with an intensity that made it impossible to look away, impossible to pretend he didn't understand what was being asked. Dennis felt his heart stop, then start again at a rhythm that seemed too fast and too slow simultaneously. "What are you saying?" Kenneth moved closer, close enough that Dennis could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count the individual eyelashes that framed them. "I'm saying maybe Sarah was right about me holding something back. Maybe I've been holding back because I was scared to admit what I really wanted, scared to acknowledge feelings that didn't fit with the story I'd been telling myself about who I was." Dennis felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, wind whipping around him, the ground solid beneath his feet, but the drop ahead both terrifying and exhilarating. "And what do you want?" "I want to find out what it feels like to kiss you," Kenneth said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to stop pretending that the way I feel when I'm with you is just friendship. I want to stop lying to myself about why I come here every day, why I'd rather spend time on your couch than anywhere else in the world." Dennis felt the world tilt on its axis, everything he thought he knew about himself and his life suddenly rearranging into new patterns. Everything he'd been trying not to feel, everything he'd been pushing down and explaining away, suddenly rushed to the surface with a force that left him breathless and shaking. "Kenneth, Tell me I'm wrong," Kenneth said, moving even closer, close enough that Dennis could smell his cologne, something woody and warm that Dennis had always associated with comfort and safety. "Tell me you don't feel it too, and I'll leave right now. I'll go home, and we can pretend this conversation never happened. We can go back to being just friends, and I'll figure out how to deal with these feelings on my own." But Dennis couldn't tell him that, because it would be a lie, and they'd built their friendship on honesty, on being able to say anything to each other without fear of judgment. He could feel the electricity crackling between them, could feel the pull that had been growing stronger every day for months. He could see the hope and fear warring in Kenneth's eyes, could feel his own heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. "I can't tell you that," Dennis admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Because I do feel it. I've been feeling it for so long, I thought I was going crazy. I thought there was something wrong with me, something broken about the way I was processing our friendship. Kenneth's eyes fluttered closed for a moment, relief washing over his features like a wave. When he opened them again, they were bright with something that looked like wonder, like a man who'd been wandering in the dark and suddenly found himself in sunlight. "Can I kiss you?" Kenneth asked. And the question was so soft, so careful, that it made Dennis's heart ache with tenderness and want. Instead of answering with words, Dennis closed the remaining distance between them, their lips meeting in a kiss that was tentative at first, questioning, both of them testing the reality of what was happening. Kenneth's lips were softer than Dennis had imagined, warm and slightly sweet from the coffee he'd been drinking. The kiss was careful, almost reverent, like they were both afraid of breaking something precious. But then Kenneth's hand came up to cup Dennis's face, thumb brushing across his cheekbone with a gentleness that made Dennis's chest tight with emotion, and the kiss deepened into something urgent and hungry and absolutely right. Dennis felt like he was drowning in sensation, in the taste and smell and feel of Kenneth, in the reality of finally being allowed to touch him this way. Dennis had kissed plenty of people before, had thought he understood what physical attraction felt like, what desire was supposed to be. But this was something entirely different, something that seemed to light up nerve endings he didn't know he had. Kenneth kissed like he was drowning, and Dennis was air, like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment without knowing it. There was desperation in it, yes, but also something deeper, something that felt like coming home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Kenneth rested his forehead against Dennis's and let out a shaky laugh that was part relief, part amazement, part disbelief. "Wow, so," Kenneth whispered, his breath warm against Dennis's lips. "Yeah," Dennis agreed, his voice rough and unsteady. "Wow." They stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, neither wanting to move and break the spell that had settled over them. Dennis felt like he was seeing color for the first time, like everything before this moment had been a pale imitation of real feeling. The apartment around them seemed different somehow, charged with new possibility, transformed by what had just happened between them. "I'm scared," Kenneth admitted quietly, his voice barely audible. "Me too," Dennis said, reaching up to touch Kenneth's face, marveling at the fact that he was allowed to do this now, that the careful boundaries they'd maintained had dissolved into something beautiful and terrifying. But also, this feels right, more right than anything has felt in a long time. Kenneth pulled back just enough to look into Dennis's eyes, searching for something, some reassurance or confirmation that this was real, that they were really doing this. "What does this mean? What do we do now?" Dennis considered the question, feeling the weight of it, the way it encompassed not just this moment, but everything that would come after. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I know I don't want to go back to pretending. I don't want it to go back to watching you date people who make you feel empty while I sit here wishing I could tell you how I really feel." "How long?" Kenneth asked, his eyes searching Dennis's face. "How long have you felt this way?" Dennis considered lying, making it seem more recent than it was, but Kenneth deserved the truth. They'd always been honest with each other, and this moment was too important to build on anything less than complete transparency. "Months," he admitted. "Maybe longer. I kept telling myself it was just friendship, just concern for someone I cared about. But every time you complained about Sarah, every time you talked about feeling disconnected, I wanted to tell you that maybe you were looking in the wrong places." Kenneth's eyes widened, and Dennis could see him processing this information, recalculating their entire friendship through this new lens. "All those times I came over complaining about my relationship, you were breaking my heart a little more each time," Dennis said with a rueful smile. "But I also couldn't stop myself from hoping that maybe you were figuring something out, maybe working towards some kind of realization." "I was," Kenneth said, wonder creeping into his voice. "I just didn't understand what I was figuring out until now." He paused, then added with a self-deprecating laugh, "All those hypothetical questions I kept asking. Not so hypothetical after all." Kenneth laughed, and the sound was lighter than Dennis had heard from him in months, free of the tension and confusion that had been weighing him down. God, I must have been so obvious. No wonder Sarah got suspicious. You weren't obvious, Dennis assured him, running his thumb along Kenneth's cheekbone. I only noticed because I was paying attention in a way that probably wasn't very platonic. They kissed again, slower this time, savoring the newness of it, the incredible fact that they were allowed to do this now. Dennis felt like he was memorizing the moment, storing away every detail to examine later when he could hardly believe this was real. The way Kenneth's lips felt against his, soft but insistent. The way Kenneth's hand tangled in his hair, fingers threading through the strands with a possessiveness that made Dennis's heart race. The small sound Kenneth made when Dennis's tongue traced his lower lip, a quiet gasp that spoke of surprise and pleasure and want. When they broke apart this time, Kenneth's cheeks were flushed, and his hair was mussed in a way that made Dennis want to kiss him again immediately, to lose himself in the warmth and taste and reality of finally being able to touch him this way. So what happens now? Kenneth asked, his voice slightly breathless. Do we tell people? Do we figure out what this means? Do we? Dennis pressed a finger gently to Kenneth's lips, stopping the spiral of questions before it could gain momentum. How about we start with dinner? We can figure out the rest as we go. Kenneth smiled against Dennis's finger, and the expression was so soft, so full of affection and relief, that it made Dennis's chest tight with emotion. Dinner sounds perfect. They ordered Thai food from their usual place, the restaurant that had become their default over months of shared meals, but everything felt different now. They ate it curled up together on the couch, the casual intimacy feeling both new and completely natural. Kenneth kept reaching over to touch Dennis's hand or arm, like he was testing the reality of being allowed to do so, like he couldn't quite believe this was happening. Dennis found himself doing the same thing, marveling at how different everything felt now that the pretense had been stripped away. I keep thinking I should feel more confused, Kenneth said as they finished eating, setting his empty container on the coffee table with the others. Like, this is a pretty major realization about myself, right? I've spent 28 years thinking I was straight, building my identity around that assumption. But instead of feeling lost or disoriented, I just feel relieved. Relieved how? Dennis asked, genuinely curious about Kenneth's internal process, about how he was making sense of this massive shift in his understanding of himself. Kenneth set down his chopsticks and turned to face Dennis fully, his expression thoughtful and open. Like, I finally understand why nothing ever felt quite right before. Why every relationship felt like I was trying to force puzzle pieces that didn't fit. Why I kept comparing everyone to some impossible standard that I couldn't even articulate. Dennis felt his heart skip. And now? Now I realized the standard wasn't impossible, it was just you. The words hit Dennis like a physical force, sweet and overwhelming, and so honest that it took his breath away. He leaned over to kiss Kenneth again, unable to resist the pull between them, the magnetic force that had been drawing them together for months, without either of them fully understanding what it was. This kiss was different from the others, deeper and more confident, both of them beginning to understand the new language they were learning together. Dennis could taste the Thai food on Kenneth's lips, could feel the way Kenneth's body relaxed into the kiss, the way his hands came up to frame Dennis's face like he was something precious. I love you, Dennis whispered against Kenneth's lips, the words slipping out before he could stop them, before he could second-guess whether it was too soon or too much. Kenneth went very still for a moment, and Dennis felt a flicker of panic, wondering if he'd moved too fast, said too much too soon. But then Kenneth's face broke into a smile so bright, it could have powered the entire apartment building, so full of joy and relief that it made Dennis's chest tight with answering happiness. I love you too, Kenneth said, and the words sounded like coming home, like the answer to a question Dennis hadn't known he'd been asking. I think I have for a while now. I just didn't know what to call it, didn't have the vocabulary to understand what I was feeling. They spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking in a way they never had before, with a level of honesty and vulnerability that felt both terrifying and necessary. Kenneth told Dennis about the growing dissatisfaction he'd felt in all his relationships with women, the sense that he was performing rather than feeling, going through the motions of romance without ever feeling truly connected to his partners. It was like I was following a script, Kenneth explained, his head resting on Dennis's shoulder as they lay stretched out on the couch together. I knew all the right things to say, all the right gestures to make, but none of it felt genuine. I kept waiting for that moment you read about in books or see in movies, that spark of connection that makes everything click into place. But it never came. Dennis talked about the confusion he'd experienced watching Kenneth with Sarah, the jealousy he tried to rationalize as protective friendship, the way his chest would tighten whenever Kenneth talked about his relationship problems. I kept telling myself I just wanted you to be happy, Dennis admitted, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Kenneth's arm. But really, I wanted you to be happy with me. I wanted to be the person who made you feel complete. You are, Kenneth said simply, lifting his head to look at Dennis with such sincerity that it made Dennis's heart ache. You're the person who makes me feel like myself, happier than I've ever been. As the evening wound down, they faced the practical question of sleeping arrangements. Kenneth had crashed on the couch dozens of times before, but everything felt different now. The couch seemed too far away, too much like the old dynamic they were trying to move beyond, too much like maintaining distance when what they both wanted was closeness. You could sleep in my bed, Dennis offered tentatively, his heart racing as he said the words. Just sleep, no pressure for anything else. I don't want you to be far away tonight. Kenneth's smile was soft and grateful, tinged with the same nervous energy that Dennis was feeling. I'd like that. I'd like that a lot. They got ready for bed with a new kind of nervous energy, brushing their teeth side by side at the bathroom sink like they were already a couple, which Dennis supposed they were now. The domesticity of it was both thrilling and comforting, this glimpse into what their life together might look like. Kenneth borrowed a t-shirt and pajama pants, and Dennis tried not to stare at the way the clothes fit him, tried not to think about the fact that Kenneth would be sleeping next to him in just a few minutes. When they finally settled into bed, there was a moment of awkwardness as they figured out how to arrange themselves, how to navigate this new intimacy. But then Kenneth reached for Dennis's hand under the covers, their fingers intertwining naturally, and the awkwardness melted away like it had never existed. This is nice, Kenneth murmured, his voice already heavy with sleep and contentment. Yeah, Dennis agreed, listening to Kenneth's breathing begin to even out, feeling the warmth of his body beside him in the bed they were now sharing. It really is. Dennis lay awake for a while after Kenneth fell asleep, marveling at the turn his life had taken in the space of a single evening. A few hours ago, he'd been resigned to loving his best friend from a distance, convinced that his feelings would never be reciprocated, that he'd spend the rest of his life watching Kenneth date other people while he nursed his secret heartbreak. Now Kenneth was sleeping beside him, their hands still linked, and everything felt possible. The next morning brought its own set of revelations and adjustments. Dennis woke up to find Kenneth already awake, watching him with an expression of wonder and tenderness that made Dennis's chest tight with affection and something that felt suspiciously like gratitude. Good morning, Kenneth said softly, his voice rough with sleep and something else, something warm and intimate that made Dennis's heart skip. Good morning, Dennis replied, suddenly self-conscious about morning breath and bedhead and all the unglamorous realities of waking up next to someone for the first time. But Kenneth didn't seem to mind, leaning over to press a gentle kiss to Dennis's lips that tasted like toothpaste and new beginnings and the promise of many more mornings like this one. I was worried I might have dreamed all of this, Kenneth admitted, his fingers tracing the line of Dennis's jaw with a reverence that made Dennis feel precious, cherished. If you did, then we're sharing the same dream, Dennis said, reaching up to touch Kenneth's face, still marveling at the fact that he was allowed to do this now, that the careful boundaries they'd maintained had dissolved into something beautiful and intimate. They made breakfast together, moving around Dennis's small kitchen with an ease that spoke to all the mornings Kenneth had been there before, but with a new intimacy that changed everything. Kenneth kept finding excuses to touch Dennis as they cooked, a hand on his back as he reached around him for the coffee, fingers brushing as they passed plates and utensils. Casual contact that felt anything but casual now that they'd crossed this threshold. The morning light streaming through the kitchen window seemed brighter somehow, casting everything in golden tones that made the ordinary act of making scrambled eggs feel significant, momentous. Dennis found himself cataloging details, storing them away like precious memories. The way Kenneth hummed under his breath as he buttered toast, the way his hair stuck up at odd angles from sleep, the way he smiled when he caught Dennis watching him. "I should probably go home at some point," Kenneth said as they sat down to eat, though his tone suggested he was in no hurry to do so. "Get some clean clothes, figure out what I'm going to tell people when they ask where I've been." Dennis felt a flicker of anxiety, the first intrusion of the outside world into their perfect bubble. "What are you going to tell people?" Kenneth reached across the table to take his hand, the gesture so natural it was like they'd been doing it for years. "The truth, that I figured out what I've been looking for, and it's you. And your family, your friends, people at work? We'll have to deal with it," Kenneth said firmly, and Dennis was struck by the certainty in his voice, the quiet strength that had emerged overnight. "I'm not going back to pretending, Dennis. I'm not going back to feeling empty just because it's easier for other people to understand." Dennis felt a surge of admiration for Kenneth's certainty, his willingness to embrace this new reality even though it would undoubtedly complicate things, even though it meant rewriting the story he'd been telling about himself for 28 years. "What about work?" "What about it? We don't work together. There's no policy against dating your best friend, even if that best friend happens to be a man." Kenneth squeezed Dennis's hand. "Besides, I'm tired of living my life based on what other people might think. I want to live it based on what makes me happy." Dennis squeezed back, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee he was drinking. "I love how matter-of-fact you're being about all this." "Are you kidding? I'm terrified." Kenneth laughed, but there was lightness in it, joy mixed with the fear. "But I'm also more sure about this than I've been about anything in years. That has to count for something." They spent the morning in bed after breakfast, not doing anything particularly romantic or sexual, just talking and occasionally kissing and marveling at the fact that they could do this now. Kenneth told Dennis about the moment he had first started questioning his feelings, a random Tuesday evening when Dennis had laughed at something on television, and Kenneth had found himself staring at his profile and thinking about how much he loved the sound of that laugh, how much he wanted to be the one responsible for putting that expression of joy on Dennis's face. Dennis shared his own moment of realization, a night a few weeks earlier when Kenneth had fallen asleep on the couch and Dennis had covered him with a blanket, lingering to watch him sleep and feeling such a powerful surge of tenderness and protectiveness that it had scared him. He'd stood there for 10 minutes just watching Kenneth's chest rise and fall, wanting to smooth the worry lines from his forehead, wanting to crawl onto the couch beside him and hold him close. "I think part of me always knew," Kenneth said thoughtfully, his head pillowed on Dennis's chest, his fingers tracing absent patterns on Dennis's stomach through his t-shirt. "I just didn't have the vocabulary for it. Growing up, the only model I had for love was what I saw with my parents, and that was so specifically heterosexual that I never thought to question whether there might be other options. And now I realize that love is love, regardless of the packaging it comes in." Kenneth smiled and pressed a kiss to Dennis's collarbone through his shirt. "And I love your particular packaging very much." Dennis laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." "Give me time. I'm new at this, but I'm a fast learner." Kenneth did eventually go home to get clean clothes and handle the practical aspects of his life. But he was back by evening with a duffel bag that suggested he was planning to stay for more than just one night. The sight of that bag sitting by Dennis's front door made something settle in Dennis's chest, a sense of rightness and permanence that he hadn't realized he'd been craving. "I know we're taking this fast," Kenneth said, setting the bag down and turning to face Dennis's with an expression that was equal parts nervous and determined. "But I don't want to be anywhere else. I don't want to spend another night in my apartment wondering what you're doing, wishing I was here instead." "Good," Dennis said, pulling him close and reveling in the fact that he could do this now, that Kenneth was his to hold and touch and love. "Because I don't want you to be anywhere else either." They fell into a routine over the following days that felt both new and completely natural. like they'd been doing this for years instead of mere days. Kenneth would go to work from Dennis's apartment in the morning, kissing him goodbye at the door like they were already an established couple. He'd come back in the evening with stories about his day, and they'd spend their time together like they always had, but with the added dimension of physical affection that had been missing before. Dennis found himself constantly amazed by how right it all felt, how seamlessly they transitioned from friends to lovers without any of the awkwardness or uncertainty he had expected. There was no sense that they were forcing something that didn't fit, no moments of regret or second guessing. If anything, Kenneth seemed to bloom under the attention, becoming more relaxed and open than Dennis had ever seen him. "You know what's funny?" Kenneth said one evening as they cooked dinner together, moving around the kitchen in perfect synchronization. "I keep waiting for the panic to set in. Like, I should be freaking out about this massive change in my identity, right? 28 years of thinking I was straight, and then suddenly I'm in love with a man. But instead, I just feel like myself for the first time in years." Dennis understood exactly what he meant. He'd been expecting some kind of crisis too, some moment when the reality of dating a man would hit him and send him spiraling into confusion or doubt. But it never came. Being with Kenneth felt as natural as breathing, as inevitable as gravity. It felt like the most obvious thing in the world, like something he should have realized years ago. "Maybe that's because this isn't really a change," Dennis suggested, wrapping his arms around Kenneth from behind as he stirred the pasta sauce. "Maybe this is just you finally being honest about who you've always been." Kenneth leaned back into the embrace, and Dennis could feel some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been gay or bisexual or whatever this whole time, and I just didn't have the framework to understand it." The first real test of their new relationship came when Kenneth ran into Sarah Collins at the grocery store while he was shopping with Dennis. Dennis had been in the produce section, debating between two different types of apples, when Kenneth found him looking slightly shaken and pale. "Sarah's here," Kenneth said quietly, his voice tight with anxiety. "She's by the dairy section, and she wants to talk." Dennis felt a stab of protective instinct, followed immediately by anxiety about how this encounter might go. "Do you want me to go? I could wait in the car." "No," Kenneth said immediately, his hand finding Dennis's and squeezing tight. "I want you to stay. We're together now, and I'm not going to hide that. I'm not going to pretend this isn't real just because it might be uncomfortable." The conversation with Sarah was awkward but not hostile. She seemed more curious than angry, her eyes moving between Kenneth and Dennis with an expression that was part confusion, part understanding, part something that might have been relief. "So this is why you always seem distant," she said to Kenneth, not unkindly. "This is what I was competing with." Kenneth was honest with her, explaining that he hadn't understood his own feelings at the time, but that yes, he thought his confusion about his sexuality had played a role in his inability to fully commit to their relationship. "I'm sorry," Kenneth told her, and Dennis could hear the genuine regret in his voice. "I never meant to hurt you. I was trying to figure myself out, but I should have been more honest about what I was going through instead of letting you think it was something you were doing wrong." Sarah looked between Kenneth and Dennis again, taking in their obvious closeness, the way they stood slightly angled toward each other even in this uncomfortable situation, the way Kenneth's free hand rested protectively on Dennis's back. "Are you happy?" she asked Kenneth, and there was something almost wistful in her voice. "Yes," Kenneth said without hesitation. "Happier than I've ever been." Sarah nodded slowly, and Dennis could see her processing this information, trying to reconcile it with the Kenneth she'd known. "Then I'm glad you figured it out. I just wish it hadn't taken so long, for both our sakes." After she left, Kenneth was quiet for a while as they finished their shopping. Dennis could see him processing the encounter, working through the emotions it had brought up, the guilt and relief and complicated feelings that came with facing someone you'd hurt, even unintentionally. "That was harder than I expected," Kenneth admitted as they drove home, their groceries in the back seat. "How so?" "Seeing how much I hurt her by not understanding myself. She deserved better than someone who was only half present in the relationship, someone who was holding back without even realizing it." Dennis reached over to take Kenneth's hand, intertwining their fingers on the center console. "You can't change the past. All you can do is be honest going forward." I know, and I am being honest now, with everyone, including my parents. Dennis felt his stomach drop. You told your parents? I called them this morning while you were in the shower, Kenneth said, and Dennis could hear the mixture of nervousness and pride in his voice. I figured they should hear it from me rather than through the grapevine or social media, or whatever. How did they take it? Kenneth was quiet for a moment, and Dennis found himself holding his breath. Better than I expected, actually. My mom said she'd wondered, especially after she met you at that barbecue last summer. Apparently, I talk about you a lot more than I realized. Dennis felt a flush of warmth spread through his chest. You talk about me to your parents? Constantly, according to my mother. She said it was obvious I cared about you deeply. She just wasn't sure in what capacity. Kenneth squeezed Dennis's hand. Now she knows. The weeks that followed brought a series of small revelations and adjustments as they navigated their new relationship, learning each other's rhythms and preferences in ways that went beyond friendship. Dennis discovered that Kenneth was surprisingly affectionate, always reaching for his hand or finding excuses to touch him throughout the day. He learned that Kenneth sang in the shower, that he liked his coffee with exactly 2 sugars and a splash of cream, that he had a habit of stealing Dennis's hoodies and wearing them around the apartment. Kenneth learned that Dennis was more romantic than he'd ever let on, bringing home flowers for no reason and leaving little notes in places Kenneth would find them. He discovered that Dennis was ticklish just below his ribs, that he made the most adorable face when he was concentrating on something, that he had strong opinions about proper dishwasher loading techniques. They had their first fight about a month in, a stupid argument about whose turn it was to do laundry that escalated into something bigger, about personal space and independence, and the challenges of suddenly living together. Dennis stormed out to get some air, his heart pounding with the unfamiliar sensation of fighting with someone he was in love with, while Kenneth retreated to the bedroom, both of them convinced they'd ruined everything. But when Dennis came back an hour later, having walked around the neighborhood until his anger cooled into regret, Kenneth was sitting on the couch, looking miserable and lost. I'm sorry, they both said at the same time, then started laughing at the absurdity of it, the tension breaking like a bubble. I've never fought with someone I was in love with before, Kenneth admitted as they curled up together on the couch, both of them still shaky from the experience. I didn't know how to do it without feeling like the world was ending. We're still learning, Dennis said, pressing a kiss to Kenneth's hair and breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo. We're allowed to make mistakes. I don't want to lose this, Kenneth said quietly, his voice muffled against Dennis's shoulder. I don't want to lose you. You won't, Dennis promised, meaning it with every fiber of his being. We'll figure it out as we go. And they did figure it out, slowly and sometimes messily, but with a determination that surprised them both. They learned to communicate better, to express their needs and concerns before they built up into resentment. They learned to give each other space when needed, to respect boundaries while still maintaining the closeness they both craved. Kenneth officially moved in after 2 months, not because they felt rushed, but because it seemed pointless to maintain 2 apartments when Kenneth never slept anywhere but Dennis's bed. They spent a weekend moving his belongings, integrating his furniture with Dennis's, making space for his books and clothes, and the accumulated detritus of a life lived independently. Dennis's apartment became their apartment, filled with Kenneth's presence in ways both large and small, his coffee mug in the dish drainer, his shoes by the front door, his laptop charger permanently plugged in beside the couch. The easy domesticity of 2 people building a life together, learning each other's habits and preferences and finding ways to accommodate them. They learned each other's rhythms and preferences in intimate detail. The way Kenneth liked his coffee and how Dennis needed 20 minutes of quiet time when he first got home from work. The way Kenneth was a morning person while Dennis was more of a night owl, and how they could accommodate these differences without sacrificing their together time. They also learned about the physical aspects of their relationship, exploring with a curiosity and tenderness that made every discovery feel like a gift. Dennis had worried that the sexual component might feel awkward or forced, especially given that neither of them had experience with men. But it turned out to be as natural as everything else between them, a physical expression of the emotional connection they'd already built. Kenneth was an enthusiastic and attentive partner, approaching intimacy with the same openness and honesty he brought to everything else in their relationship. He was curious and generous, eager to learn what Dennis liked, and equally eager to share his own preferences and desires. I can't believe I thought I was straight for 28 years, Kenneth said one evening, as they lay in bed, both of them pleasantly exhausted from their explorations. How did I miss something this fundamental about myself? Maybe you weren't ready to see it, Dennis suggested, tracing lazy patterns on Kenneth's chest, marveling at the fact that he was allowed to touch him this way. Maybe you needed to be in the right place with the right person. Maybe, Kenneth agreed, catching Dennis's hand and pressing it flat against his heart. Or maybe I just needed to stop being so scared of what other people would think. The comment made Dennis realize how brave Kenneth had been throughout this entire process. He'd upended his entire understanding of himself, faced potential rejection from family and friends, and embraced a future that looked completely different from what he'd always planned. And he'd done it all with a grace and certainty that Dennis found inspiring. I'm proud of you, Dennis said suddenly, the words coming from somewhere deep in his chest. Kenneth looked surprised, tilting his head to meet Dennis's eyes. For what? For being brave enough to follow your heart, even when it led you somewhere you didn't expect. Kenneth's eyes went soft, and he reached up to cup Dennis's face with his free hand. I didn't have a choice. Once I understood what I was feeling, I couldn't unknow it. I couldn't go back to pretending. You could have, Dennis pointed out. Plenty of people do. Plenty of people spend their whole lives living a lie because it's easier than facing the truth. Not with you, Kenneth said firmly. I couldn't pretend with you. You see too much of me, know me too well. I couldn't lie to you even if I wanted to. Dennis felt his heart swell with love for this man who had turned his world upside down in the best possible way. I love seeing all of you. Good, Kenneth said, pulling Dennis down for a kiss that tasted like promises and forever. Because I plan on showing you everything. 6 months after that first kiss, they hosted a dinner party for their friends and family, a celebration that was part housewarming, part relationship announcement, part declaration of their commitment to each other and to this life they were building together. It was Kenneth's idea, a way to officially introduce Dennis as his partner to the people who mattered most to them, to create a space where their relationship could be celebrated rather than simply tolerated or accepted. Dennis had been nervous about it for weeks, worried about how their families would interact, whether anyone would make things awkward, whether the reality of their relationship might be too much for some people to handle. But Kenneth had been determined, and his certainty had been infectious. The evening was a success beyond Dennis's wildest hopes. Kenneth's parents were warm and welcoming, treating Dennis like a son-in-law rather than a curiosity, asking about his job and his family with genuine interest. They'd brought a bottle of wine and a photo album full of embarrassing pictures of Kenneth as a child, which they delighted in sharing with Dennis despite Kenneth's protests. Dennis's own family, who had always liked Kenneth even when he was just Dennis's friend, seemed genuinely happy that their relationship had evolved into something deeper. His mother fussed over Kenneth like she'd been waiting years for Dennis to bring home someone worthy of her approval, and his father engaged Kenneth in a lengthy discussion about sports that left both men looking pleased with themselves. You two make sense together, Dennis's sister told him as they cleaned up after dinner, stacking plates and loading the dishwasher while the others lingered over coffee and dessert in the living room. I always wondered why you never seemed fully invested in your relationships with women. Now I understand. Was it that obvious? Dennis asked, genuinely curious about how others had perceived him during those years when he hadn't understood himself. Not obvious exactly, she said thoughtfully, pausing in her plate stacking to consider the question. But you always seemed like you were holding something back, like you were going through the motions without really feeling it. With Kenneth, you seemed complete, like you finally found the missing piece. Dennis looked through the kitchen doorway to where Kenneth was laughing at something his father had said, his face bright with genuine happiness, and felt a surge of gratitude for the path that had led them here. A year ago, he never could have imagined this life, this happiness, this sense of everything falling into place exactly as it should. Later that night, as they got ready for bed and rehashed the evening's successes, Kenneth pulled Dennis into his arms and held him close. Thank you, Kenneth said quietly, his voice warm with emotion and something that sounded like wonder. For what? for being patient with me while I figured myself out, for not giving up on me when I was too scared to see what was right in front of me, for loving me enough to wait. Dennis pulled back to look at Kenneth's face, seeing nothing but love and contentment there, the kind of deep satisfaction that came from being exactly where you belonged. I would have waited as long as it took. I know, Kenneth said, and there was something almost reverent in his voice. That's what makes you so easy to love. They kissed then, slow and sweet, the kind of kiss that spoke of permanence and promise, of a love that had grown from friendship into something deeper and more lasting. Dennis thought about how far they'd come from that first tentative question about kissing another man, how much courage it had taken for both of them to admit what they were feeling. I love you, Dennis said against Kenneth's lips, the words as easy and natural as breathing. I love you too, Kenneth replied, more than I ever thought possible. As they settled into bed together, Dennis reflected on the unexpected turns life could take. He'd spent years thinking he understood himself, thinking he knew what his future would look like. But the best things in life, he was learning, were often the ones you never saw coming. Kenneth had started coming over after work as a friend seeking comfort and advice. He'd stayed because he'd found something he didn't even know he was looking for. And now, lying in their shared bed with Kenneth's arm around him and their future stretching out ahead of them, full of possibility, Dennis couldn't imagine wanting anything different. Dennis, Kenneth whispered in the darkness, his voice soft and contemplative. Hmm? Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't asked that question about kissing another guy? If I'd never worked up the courage to be honest about what I was feeling? Dennis considered this, turning the question over in his mind like a puzzle. Sometimes. But I think we would have found our way here eventually. The feelings were too strong to ignore forever. The connection too deep to dismiss. I'm glad we didn't have to wait any longer, Kenneth said, pressing a kiss to Dennis's shoulder, his lips warm against Dennis's skin. Me too, Dennis agreed, feeling sleep beginning to pull him under. Me too. Outside their window, the city hummed with its usual nighttime energy, full of people living their own complicated lives, making their own discoveries about love and identity and what it meant to be truly happy. But inside their apartment, everything was exactly as it should be. Two men who had found in each other not just love, but understanding, not just passion, but peace. Kenneth's breathing evened out first, and Dennis lay listening to it for a while, marveling at how safe and right it felt to have him there. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to grow together and support each other through whatever life might bring. But tonight they were exactly where they needed to be. Dennis closed his eyes and let himself drift off to sleep, Kenneth's warmth beside him and the certainty of their love surrounding them both like a promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that caught you completely off guard, the ones that forced you to rewrite everything you thought you knew about yourself. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those stories led you exactly where you belonged. In the morning, they would wake up together and make coffee and plan their day, the ordinary magic of a life shared with someone who understood you completely. They would navigate the small challenges and large joys that came with building a relationship, learning and growing, and becoming more themselves in the process. But for now, they slept peacefully in each other's arms, two hearts that had found their home.